Morphosis. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā kārangatanga huhu o ngā haue whā tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou, a kia ora hui hui mai tātou katoa. Indigenous knowledge has value. Indigenous knowledge has worth. Most importantly, Indigenous knowledge can provide answers and offer solutions to contemporary problems. By the end of my talk, you will have a glimpse into the understanding of why. And so, my story begins at the Chatham Islands. The Chatham Islands are a group of islands that lie roughly 680 kilometres southeast of mainland New Zealand. They are known by the Māori as whareakauri and by the indigenous peoples of these islands, the Moriori, as reakohu. In scale, the Chathams are roughly half the size of Stewart Island and are home to around 600 people of European, Māori and Moriori descent. The landscape of the Chathams itself is quite spectacular. A mixture of volcanic peaks, flat swamplands, lagoons and sandy beaches. But to the uninitiated, the Chathams is also coldly unforgiving. Vastly deforested for sheep and cattle farming, there are few places of shelter. The weather changes quickly and bowed trees pay testament to the strong southerlies that lash the land and churn the sea. Upon visiting the Chatham Islands, it is easy to understand how its solitary and isolated location provided the perfect destination for the New Zealand government to exile and imprison its enemies. For what is not widely known or widely recorded in the history of our country is that in the 1860s, the New Zealand government utilised the Chatham Islands as a penal facility, to which they exiled and imprisoned without charge or trial more than 300 Māori men, women and children who they had classified as rebels or in rebellion against the Crown. Now these people were not just stripped of all lands and possessions, but they were exiled from their country of birth. And it was here on the Chatham Islands without hope of escape that they were imprisoned indefinitely. Now why I share their story with you now is that their story is my story. My great-grandmother was just a young girl when she was taken from her home to imprisonment on the Chatham Islands along with her parents and her younger siblings. And it was there that she would eventually lose her mother and her younger sister. Our oral tradition still speaks of the arrival of the prison barge to the Chatham Island shores on a cold and wet winter's morning, and how the prisoners arrived to no food and no shelter, as the government of the time had deemed that these very essentials the prisoners must provide for themselves. And so in the wet and the rain and the cold, they built makeshift shelters of fern fronds and scavenged for food to feed themselves and their children. Now in hindsight, it is not a leap of the imagination to understand the true reasoning of their imprisonment, that they had been imprisoned to die at this place. But like so many stories of our people, dying was something my ancestors refused to do. They survived, despite everything they survived. And when I first visited the Chatham Islands in 2011 and stood at the place that my ancestors had lived and died, though awash with emotion, this was the question which plagued me in particular. How did they survive? How did they survive a hostile environment to which they were unaccustomed and ill-prepared? How did they survive the brutality of a 17th century British penal system? How did they survive the beatings, the floggings, the rapes, the forced hard labor, malnutrition and illness that claimed so many of their lives? What beliefs and values did they draw upon to survive in the darkness of their imprisonment? Now, it was in contemplation of this question and others that I came to certain specific cultural understandings of the principles I believe my ancestors utilized to survive their imprisonment, and principles which still have contemporary application and can contribute towards positive change in our lives and in the lives of others. But firstly, to understand these principles, we must understand their source. Now, my ancestors looked to the natural world, our environment, as the greatest teacher. They did this in the central understanding that the environment that surrounded us had evolved over billions of years and was operating in a state of perfection. All we needed to do was to watch and observe and incorporate those teachings, that wisdom, that truth into our lives. In doing so, my ancestors created unique knowledge systems based upon the natural flows and rhythms of our environment. Knowledge systems which place collective and spiritual well-being ahead of individual and material need. One such example was found in the flight of the kuaka. Now, the kuaka is renowned as having the longest flight path of any bird on the planet. Flying from Alaska to Aotearoa, New Zealand every year, covering more than 17,000 kilometers and flying non-stop for 8 days, without food, without water, without rest, without sleep. Now, the flight of the kuaka has brought international scientific inquiry to our shores, focused specifically upon how such a small and inconspicuous bird accomplishes such a monumentous task. Now, when my ancestors looked to the kuaka, they observed that it flied in a V-shaped formation, which they named Te Kāhui. They also observed that a singular bird leads this flock, which they named Te Manutaki Te Kāhui, or the leader of the flock. But most importantly, my ancestors recognized that this leader does not lead for the duration of the flight, but rather when fatigue sets in, this bird falls back and another bird rises to that place of leadership, that position of leadership. Therefore, my ancestors understood that the kuaka does not traverse immense distances based upon the strength, the will, the drive of the one, but the collective strength, the collective will, the collective vision of the whole. Through examples such as the flight of the kuaka, my ancestors defined 3 distinct principles. Principles that enabled a people to collectivize, to unify for common goal and common purpose. The first of these principles, and most important, is Kawa. Kawa may be defined in this instance as the guiding philosophy. The collective aim, the communal goal, that dream, that vision you aspire to achieve. For those prisoners on the Chatham Islands, this was merely survival, to survive the brutality of their imprisonment. This was the vision that collectivized them. This was the goal that unified them. This was their light in their darkness. In a contemporary context, Kawa may be the well-being and prosperity of your whānau, your family. It may be social or political change, but whatever it may be, Kawa is where the deep thinking must take place. For this philosophy will lead and guide every aspect of practice and endeavour that follows. And without a clear and defined vision, you are lost from the beginning. The second principle is tikanga. Tikanga may be defined in this instance as the practice which supports the guiding philosophy. At the core of tikanga are collective beliefs and values. Collective beliefs and values of which my ancestors had many. Collective beliefs and values are vitally important because they inform attitude and behaviour and ensured that whatever endeavour was undertaken, it was undertaken in an ethical and moral way. Collective beliefs and values were vitally important for those prisoners on the Chatham Islands, for though they were from different tribes, they shared this common knowledge base. So when they engaged with their skills and their abilities, they engaged the same way. In a contemporary context, we all understand how easier it is to accomplish a goal when the people you work beside believe the same things, value the same things, aspire towards the same things. The third principle is kaupapa. Kaupapa may be defined in this context as the utilization of these beliefs and values for specific endeavour. For those prisoners on the Chatham Islands, this was merely the everyday struggle for survival. Food, shelter, clothing, medicine, perhaps in a contemporary context that is not too dissimilar, but what must be understood is that every endeavour undertaken must contribute towards the guiding philosophy. And though I have discussed these principles in isolation, it must be understood that they operate in unison, in seamless unison, and the intangible bond which connects them all is wairuatanga, spirituality, or the power of the Spirit. My ancestors' spirituality was based upon the centrality and sacredness of life itself, that all life had value, that all life had worth, and most importantly, that we were connected to all life through a multitude of universal kinship ties. In a contemporary context, this spirituality of connection may be understood as a deeper feeling or understanding one has when one is focused in mind and body on a specific endeavour, an endeavour which takes us out of ourselves and connects us to others, ideals, causes, movements, social momentum. This feeling, this understanding is a spiritual connection. And so these are the principles I believe my ancestors utilized to survive their imprisonment. Principles which teach the importance of being unified in mind, body, and spirit to accomplish any great deed. And this is but one example of thousands of examples held within our Indigenous knowledge. Knowledge which offers answers, solutions, and alternatives to contemporary problems. And I believe that now more than ever, our world is in need of solutions and alternatives. And I believe that this is an awakening, a realization that is happening globally. As globally people are realizing that the systems put in place by the dominant powers are broken systems. They are corrupted systems. They are systems that have caused global economic poverty and inequality, global environmental degradation and exploitation. Globally, people are realizing that the answers to these problems cannot be found in the same knowledge that created them. And this is where Indigenous knowledge has value. This is where it has worth because it is founded upon different principles. Principles which favor connection rather than isolation, which favor protection rather than exploitation, principles which offer change, principles which offer hope. Now, of course, there will be those that question the value of the knowledge that I have shared, that question the worth of its contemporary application. And in response to these doubts, what I failed to mention at the beginning of my talk was that my ancestors' goal was just not to survive their imprisonment. It was to escape their imprisonment. And in July 1868, after nearly 3 years of imprisonment, led by the Māori warrior prophet Te Aotearoa Te Turuki, the prisoners arose in unison, subduing the prison guard and commandeering the supply ship, the Rifleman. And despite the brutality to which they had been subject, there was no violence. There was no arson, there was no looting, there was no retribution of any kind. And 3 days later, on the 17th of July, 1868, the Rifleman anchored in the sheltered cove of Whareongonga off the east coast of the North Island, carrying in its hold and on its deck 297 elderly men, women, and children, the entire prison population of the Chatham Islands. Our oral tradition speaks of how the prisoners leapt from the longboats to the shore, weeping and caressing the land as if a long-lost loved one they never hoped or dreamed that they would see again. But they had returned. United in mind, body, and spirit, they had survived their imprisonment. They had found their freedom. And most importantly, they had accomplished it together. No one was left behind. Now, at the beginning of my talk, I said that this was my story. But this is not just my story. This is our story. For this is but one of the many threads that make up the fabric of the collective history of our country. And my ancestors' struggle and sacrifice for justice and for freedom, it deserves to be acknowledged. It deserves to be remembered. And we are no less of a people or a country for having done so. For an acknowledgement of our past, it symbols an intent for the present and encapsulates our collective hopes, dreams, and desires for the future. So in the closing of our story, I would like to share with you the words of my ancestors, whose teachings and wisdom I have drawn upon throughout. My ancestors who stand here in spirit with me now. These are their words, the words of the past to the generations of the present. He kōpū tahi tāta, he taura here tangata. Whiringa nuku whiringa rangi te whatia e, te whatia e. We are born of the same womb, tied in the bonds of humanity, tied to the heavens above us, tied to the earth beneath us. These are bonds that can never be severed. From this life unto the next, we are but one family. Nō reira rā e tei, papaki kaua na ngā tai o mihi e pare nui atu ana ki te ako aroha. Tēnei ki o wauerere tohi tuatu rā ngā mihi mata kui ngā mihi mata kua ki a ko tau. Nō reira aku rangatira tēnā ko tau. Tēnā ko tau. Huri no tō tātou whare. He o rohi hui mai tātou katoa.